Hello everyone, just a brief note about Volga Bulgar warfare between the 11th and the 14th century for our High Medieval Regional Warfare Introduction series, as unfortunately these people and area are not dramatically documented. As we will see, at least it's difficult to trace exactly who was who in a determinate context. That we could define a frontier in a sense between the Turkic steppe, the Ugro-Finnic forests, also the Kievan Rus, and with lots of influences even from far away, from the same Persia, Mesopotamia, Caucasus, and later on especially the Mongol one. So the Volga Bulgaria or Volga Kama Bulgaria, because this is the broader river net connection with the Kama flowing into the Volga, and so representing a very important hub for Eurasian trade, and as we will see on a dramatic range, was in fact a historic Bulgar state existing between the 7th and the 13th century. It had fundamentally developed from the Bulgar diaspora that of the early Middle Ages that had brought, for example, part of the people to migrate in Bulgaria. In fact, in the Balkans, in the Southern Slavic lands, others scattered in other areas. This is the northeastern branch, right? What is now European Russia, fundamentally, as eventually the Rus first tried to hegemonize the area before the Mongols arrived, and then when essentially the Muscovy remounted, this area was absorbed, and there is actually the Khanate of Kazan that is today we don't discuss that because it comes later in a way, but it's a bit like the Bulgar successor state in a sense with a Mongol influence, but also the storming of Kazan is somewhat famous in military history, etc., and it witnesses an important regional center that had existed and coalesced, Bulgar and Belar, that constituted properly also the centers of government, the former being raised down by the Mongols, and the latter evolving later on as the main political administrative centers under this, in fact, kind of Tartar influence, but even the former settlement actually being repopulated after having lost something like 80% of the population. And the military features of Volga Bulgaria are reflected by the multicultural nature of the state that included, in fact, this base of Turkic Bulgars that were, however, originally mixed with a lot of Indo-Iranians, Sarmatians mostly. Parts of which, in turn, however, had already received probably important Turkic influence since the 2nd century AD due to the Hunnic migrations and even some East Asian influence already by that point, as we were telling at some day before by discussing the Hunnic identity. Let's say then there was a variety of Finnic and Ugric peoples from the northern forests. They're very difficult to distinguish archaeologically at the time, as they think even about the Magyars, etc. That more or less fought, in fact, in the same ways in the region. Many East Slavs that also had adopted an important amount of steppe warfare, but that also brought in the same Turkic Bulgaria kind of a heavier type of warfare. In fact, this is an interesting feature we notice among these Bulgars. They should have been fighting in a more conventional Turkic way, but seemingly were heavier and more influenced by. It was also just because of the nature of their feudalism, in a sense, the fact that they had importantly sedentarized around these main centers that, as we will see, were dramatically rich, and there were lots of imports, also of heavier equipment, as we will see, from far away as Germany, since Carolingian times. And it's the very strategic position of Volga Bulgaria that allowed the monopoly of a trade route that connected the Arabs, the Norse, the Avars. They all left, say, a trace. In part, there's Baltic influence in their equipment as well. There are also subject peoples, as we will see, that gravitated around this system, such as the Vest, the Maria, etc. And let's say that Volga Bulgars are some of the least known, and in part, the sense, most neglected of medieval Islamic peoples. They converted in the 9th century, if I'm not wrong, to Sunni Islam because of the caliphal influence. And as for other neighboring peoples, they technically were at that point under the Khazars still, that had converted, for example, to Judaism to be more presentable internationally, especially to Constantinople, but they had Muslims themselves. Say this pertained to the elite as a broader, in fact, internationalizational phenomenon, and it is reflected also from a military point of view by the context, the imports, etc. Whereas the rest of the population probably was kind of more traditional. At least they could even convert by a degree, but they still practiced paganism in parallel, right? And they didn't see any divide between the two things, and therefore they also probably looked much more Turkic in military culture, and those would have been like the large mass of mostly horse archers. And the reason why the Volga Bulgars have been reevaluated, I haven't followed the historiography of it, but for example, the results was made recently on it. It's part of this broader kind of early high medieval revival of Easternness, because it looks, fashionable with lamellar armor, stuff like that. You'll see, actually Volga Bulgars didn't have even too much of that. They were even more Western influenced. But the problem being, of course, the fact we are just archaeologically related. Like we don't, to this history, like we don't have essentially any Volga Bulgar autonomous account that wasn't manipulated in some way eventually. So we mostly rely also on a material evidence that, as I often say, doesn't really have a tag. So archaeology is overrated in the sense that, of course, it's important and all, but when we look, especially at this time, at material cultures that were essentially homogeneous and where you have just a very few finds, and when you have them, sometimes you can't even date them accurate, because let's say the changes were slow, gradual. They can be from different centuries, from different peoples. Even the way the samples were collected at a point historically in times like, I don't know, the Soviet Union or other, that had its own archaeological, in fact, activity, but still at a point was, especially in the case of the Volga Bulgars, accidental in some ways. Even, they were collected before this time, and eventually there was no adequate recording. This is typical, unfortunately, of the broader Turkic area, about which we literally don't know much properly from just even a historical point of view. We see peoples with names, with properly ethnonyms, identities, cultures, but very often they're blended, exchanged, and we don't know what could be really like by the High Middle Ages, where much had not yet been superimposed. There hadn't been properly the changing of an identitary, reference, and therefore these are unfortunately populations that will remain, in a sense, at the margin of our historical understanding, but still present certain features that are worth pointing out. What is striking is the capacity of the Volga Bulgars to aggregate. Right, archaeology has clarified the great importance of the trade networks the Bulgars were dominating and attracting other peoples into their lands through their Islamic tradition and behavior that had coped with the Turkic cultural background, but also this far northern world of harsh winters, dense forests and mountains that at a point is also showing displaying some of the most archaic traits in military development. We've seen it in the relative video about the Eurasia, let's say in general, during the Mongol era. It was a bit like a diversion from the usual in this series, but still displaying the important waves of changes that also occurred, and how some very primitive but effective means of war still existed at that time. So Volga Bulgaria was characterized by its towns, essentially fortified enclosures that had emerged normally, a bit like there is a similarity even with the Viking activity, as especially after the Bulgar capital was destroyed, many Bulgars also reverted to some kind of river raiding, warfare with pine boats. It was a very interesting thing, and they had begun probably in a similar way, aside from the the specific steppe bias that they had, very dynamically in that sense, adapting to the different landscape that is different from the steppe per se. And so accumulating agricultural surplus, loot, and tributes in these towns prospered, that developed dramatically. If you think about Kazan before the Russian conquest, and or in fact the Bulgar capital before the Mongol destruction, and the general let's say continuity that still in Tartar times, let's say, it was with the centers. But well, that's really extraordinary. Mosques were built. They were essentially an export-orientated economy. They had something you can't describe with caution, like properly organized state armies that depended on these centers and their rulers appearing as early as the 10th century. The Volga Bulgars mostly exported clothing, armor, weapons, but also they imported a lot, especially of the latter, from the most updated, military updated regions, not even the neighboring ones, supplying, in fact, this demand with imports from Iran and even Western Europe. After 1100, however, the Volga Bulgar region came under Christian Russian pressure, as the Khivans were very interested, in fact, in the area. They wanted to hegemonize it, which is fascinating because first, as you know, the Kievan Rus had destroyed the Khazars, and in a sense this had brought to further Volga Bulgar prosperity in the north of the area. And so they were interested rather not much only in some other western kind of direction, but also in this one. And there were wars fought, and as a consequence also an hybridation of Volga Bulgar warfare with a more westernized one brought by the Russians. In fact, we know that some Volga Bulgars had even converted to Christianity by the early and mid 12th century, which was normal, also considering the same Russian presence in the region. Right, there were lots of Eastern Slavs that had historically migrated in this area under the Bulgar lords, and this is reflected, as we will see, in Volga Bulgar military equipment, horse furniture, and perhaps even tactics. Right, albeit when we look at their fully documented battle formations and just way of war, we realize that of course it was a strong Turkic base to this. For example, the typical this, but it was shared by the peoples inhabiting the area. Like even the Ugro-Finnic Magyars fought basically like that also when they migrated in Europe for a while, having essentially a weak center and strong wings and skirmishing with lighter troops in the front and trying to envelop the enemy. This was basically standard tactics that the Kipchaks, the the Mongols used as well, and it was just more effective for the steppe environment. But as we were saying before, the degree of sedentarization of Volga Bulgaria brought also to some kind of heavening, let's say, a weighing of the heavy cavalry, especially along some patterns that seem to have been, in fact, more Western-like by a certain degree than the other Turkic neighbors. Like if you look at the Seljuks at the same time, they fought in a much more kind of distinctive Central Asian way. The Bulgars seems to, like, this is typical of the Western steppes in a sense, to become kind of a heavier. This was seen among the, let's say, heavier in on average, right? The ultra elite actually becoming slightly lighter, because in the heart of the steppe, for example, the combination of Lancer / Archer at some point was, especially in more tribal times, was kind of identified by single individuals, and they surely existed throughout all Bulgar history, but they had decreased. But to say a spread of armor among even the lesser troops, reflecting that degree of sedentarization, normally you don't find among the nomads, and so even there are important changes that we can observe also among other peoples that we documented. I have a medieval steppe or steppe warfare playlist as well in general that explains a bit this process, and this was naturally also due to the original ethnic melange of the Bulgars in their ethnogenesis, telling the truth, but also and especially in this kind of more fringe area, we can say, so heavier close combat cavalry features significantly, right, compared to the ratio you find normally among steppes peoples at the time. This is also explained by the nature of the terrain, in part that is minor, because geopolitics does not exist, but still that was also yet another thing. For example, Mongol armies also met with some defeat when they tried to attack the Volga Bulgars initially. That's also why their retaliation was so merciless, by the way. But, the Samara Gulf, let's say, of meander, we can say, and also the forests, the different ground from the open steppe, right, can have played a part in this. By the 13th century, some neighboring / tributary tribes, such as the Ves and the Maria, had become Christians, while the others, such as the Ugra-Finnic Ugra, had slipped out even of Volga Bulgar suzerainty into, at that point, the northern Russian Principality of Novgorod, that also extended because of this trade links in the far north towards the east, right, in kind of wild areas, but that still had an interesting traffic of some sort. That Novgorod was very much like a commercial republic, we can say, compared to the much more, especially in post-Mongol times, radically autocratic and absolutistic power of especially of those Russians that had practically been created politically by the Mongols themselves, starting imminently from Moscow. The same weakening of the Bulgar domination in the latter phase of this period is witnessed by the loss of control on the eastern Bashkirs and the similarly Turkic Burtas, and finally in 1236 and 1237 the Mongols arrive and wipe the hell out of the Volga Bulgars' capital. So speaking of the post-Mongol Khanate of Kazan, if you look at during the 15th century, you realize that it was based exactly on the same Volga Bulgar pre-existing domination, right? So there is an important degree of continuity, also because the capital and other centers were remembered, like the great Bulgar centers, etc. Not much remains archaeologically of this. There are interesting here. unfortunately, as you understand, first of all, I have a problem with copyright for which I can't post everything, but there are very few kind of distinctive and certainly Volga Bulgarian, say, finds. Some are associated to similar peoples. We don't know whether they're Khazars, whether they're Ugro-Finnic, whether sometimes even properly from where these finds were taken, as we were saying in the beginning. So I wouldn't post much, but there are, say, some towers, for example, broader town foundations, etc., that do date back to those times and that remain incorporated eventually into what were essentially seized as Russian citadels, Kremlins, and with all the the imposant rampart earthworks mostly. What we see is that the Volga Bulgar era was rich in timber, so they, thanks to their wealth deriving from trade, they began to have enough wealth and manpower to organize this massive works that were sometimes really imposing, at least for their type of warfare. They pose significant difficulties for invaders, etc. And that is also just a measure of their broader political power. Just think, again, up to the few centuries before, in there was, you can say nothing, but surely none of that. So speaking of the Volga Bulgar military organization, we see a rather obvious, simple, and effective one that has much in common with, again, the other Turkic traditions, but also with the Russian one, right? We can argue that there was not much of a difference between the Russian Drudzina and the Turkic Ashum Yane, let's say, and the latter being essentially a split difference between the guards, the heavier troops, and the younger or the youngest Drudzina. So the habitual, say, wealth and age segmentation within the military clienteles of these Turkic warlords. And we talk about significant manpower, probably the maximum field strength of a Bulgar army was something between, say, 10, 15,000 troops, right? We can assume, given that we assess that 1/10 of the male population was bound to military service in this clientelar fashion, that the manpower, especially in terms of mounted warriors of the Volga Bulgars between their main centers, was something from between 15 and 20,000 men, but mobilizing them all at a time was, impossible or / unnecessary. And we know of, in fact, several thousand troops being recorded in several occasions, both in terms properly of manpower and as losses of a part of a greater wall. And we witness, however, as we were saying before, between the 12th and the 13th century, that was a moment of crisis, but at the same time also of development. In many ways, probably a reduction to something less, but with a qualitative increase, which is absolutely normal. It's the same old story of the steppe people that initially is very much militarized among even the lesser individuals. They came from a very intense background dominated by metus hostilis and consequent political cohesion. These people had been crushed, as we've seen, more or less in today's era of Ukraine during the early medieval centuries, and so a part of this had arrived up to the Volga, the point where probably they had already lost cohesion, and which probably in fact favored the blending among the local populace and the more sedentary ways of life, even though it wasn't really a fully sedentarized era either. But with all the trade going on, especially in high medieval times, the gentrification of these elements would bring to, as we were saying before, to kind of more civilized way of life and to a more kind of engineer type of military service, a bit like in the West, right? In the West, we didn't all live in war. It was a broader organization based on the local surplus and just an elite vote, etc. So it was becoming like that as well. You see fundamentally the equipment happening, also perhaps because of the fact of imports, but just essentially being a consequence of the increasing divide between the elite and the rest of the population, also in a functionalized role, probably, in fact, the military and the labor one. And we see an important spread of arm or metal armor, coated mails, for example, that seem to be more present on average than other Turkic peoples, both in relative and in absolute terms. Probably 1/10, just like in Europe, of the mounted warriors, or the warriors in general, had mail armor, full mail armor. I mean, and however, this proportion seemingly increased towards the later times, exactly as it was happening in Europe, where squires by the end of the 13th century were fundamentally undistinguishable from the rest of the knights. There was probably some sort of professionalization warfare increasingly, but you see parallel happening of their warfare. Naturally, there were subject populations that maintained kind of a more rustic way of war. We see the Mari, the Mordians. An Arab traveler passing by mentions in his stories the term Saria to describe detachment of such tribal princes consisting of 4,000 horsemen, right? So this naturally depended on the political cohesion of the Bulgars on the Volga. If they were strong, they could levy larger and could convince more people to fight in one and another. And so we don't have to just be particularly strict about how many troops or whatever. They would just fight on a regular basis. They knew how to organize themselves accordingly. Among the most interesting archaeological finds of early medieval military equipment within what was the territory of the Volga Bulgars, we find no less than 12 Carolingian style swords of the Ulfbert type style, and therefore we realize they're very heavy swords, as you know, double-edged, massive, kind of essentially they had evolved from the migration era Sparta and the older, in fact, kind of knightly weapon also of the steppes, eventually kind of rearranged in Central Europe, and they entailed naturally an ultra elite in a sense. We think that the Volga Bulgarians may have just imported them for matter of status, but it's just a bit too gnostic to pretend to separate the two things. They were used in battle, right? Just the amount of which the Bulgars could afford proportionally, we don't know, but given this prominence in archaeological finds, we think that it was something. So consider that these swords were produced in the Middle Rhine, right? So that's how far they traveled, and how much the Bulgars were willing to pay to have such weaponry. And we find, in fact, interesting influences from similar ranges of distance, let's say, in terms of foreign imports of weapons and armor, right? As we were saying before, we really can't be sure 100% about whether this was Bulgar stuff, or maybe it was imported by other peoples, or so it's very complicated even just to reconstruct a standard type of Bulgar horseman. But we can see there this important wagoning from an early time, like this finds at that point date to the outskirts of the civilized world in later times, right? These were Carolingian era swords, and we find them in this far north and east in something like the early 11th century. So eventually they would grow outdated, and definitely they weren't the only swords that the Bulgars had, without mentioning that, of course, the main weapon in many ways still was the spear, right? At least by probably from a quantitative point of view. Whenever you find heavy swords, you do find an anti-armor function, even though people mostly say, oh, well, but, armor was generally effective against swords, etc. Well, this is a liminal point, especially when you realize that until the spread of plate armor, swords were considered properly in a very different ways. Of course, true that, even at that point, the sword wouldn't become an armor cutter by a certain degree, but let's say the idea that a full blow could first of all cause a devastating trauma, but at a certain point was kind of designed even to break armor, even though bit by bit, even though with difficulty and great forces, something that can kind of hardly replicate in a way, and especially we have to consider there were different qualities out there. The way these people fought, nobody really knows, right? It's useless to pretend. You make HEMA reenactment, you know how they, but nobody knows and has the palest idea of how it actually was. And doing these tests doesn't really lead anywhere concrete, just because simply we don't have enough data to even know whether what we replicate is really, in fact, mirroring what existed at the time in a positive scientific fashion. So it's kind of some kind of problem that we always stumble on, but it would be interesting, of course, to look at more in depth, but it's fundamentally, in fact, in part time lost. In any case, spears came, of course, also in different types, ranging from simple thrust weapons for use on foot and horseback, to more specifically armor-piercing forms that would have probably been used by the elite Bulgar cavalry that actually made extensive use of maces, bludgeons. This was typical of axes, as we will see now, of Turkic peoples. The latter axis not completely, like there was more kind of Middle Eastern, in part even Ugrian, Ugro-Finnic kind of influence in there. The same Russian axes, for example, were heavily nomadic, influenced by a certain degree. But it's obvious that the elite fights against the elite. All right, they are armored enough to come at close range, and therefore they can use particular types of weapons that are properly designed to be kind of can openers, in a sense, in inflicting this devastating damage to the same armor. Of course, as we've just seen, there was among the Volga Bulgars a heavier bias than the rest of the Kipchaks, let's say, for this properly close combat among cavalry, so we can imagine even some greater frequency of properly frontal impact among the heavier cavalry than usual, because all cavalry always can charge frontally against anything, right? The point is what condition, how frequently would it come? Normally the steppe peoples have just a tiny, heavily armored elite, and that's why instead the Volga Bulgars seem to be more interesting, because they look more a bit like the Rus, a bit more some kind of, in fact, westernized type of military styles. And the simplest spears stand with leaf-shaped blades designed to just opening massive wounds, and especially in order for spreading infection. Used by ordinary infantry that didn't have much of an armor, a protection that could, in fact, say, spare them from this kind of damage. And I don't think there is enough data to describe any sensible kind of characteristic of Volga Bulgar infantry. Let's say that the steppes always had infantry, even though, of course, cavalry was more important. The steppes is very different. Also, just climatologically, in terrain, in many ways to differentiate, right? There were some islands within the steppes were, for example, dramatically advanced from a technological point of view. We've seen it on the video about, in fact, Mongol era Eurasian warfare, and others were dramatically primitive. And normally infantry didn't have much of a function, of course, out there in the steppe, because it could really easily be outmaneuvered, and more than else it would be probably used to comfort, in fact, as an auxiliary force. Cavalry was decisive, and then mostly defending fanatically these towns, these fortified centers. If you look at all the European crescent that from the Balkans goes up to, in fact, northeastern Russia, you see that in medieval times the local militias, because cavalry was this, so infantry militias, because cavalry was decisive anyway among their people as well, developed in an anti kind of nomadic fashion. There are certain specific types of shields, more sort of rectangular shape. There is an important degree of missile fire within with bows. Eventually, the spreading of crossbows, even there, that probably boosted some also technological advancement regarding specifically infantry warfare. Right, cavalry warfare was very advanced. But again, we don't see anything about among the Volga Bulgars that necessarily speaks of dramatically advanced infantry. Still, however, considering that they were, again, more sedentary in nature, more urbanized by a certain degree, surely they did have an important amount of infantry, and also probably one that was effective against cavalry as well. So aside from archaeological finds that we can measure it a little bit from the broader context, we find also javelins naturally used by both cavalry and infantry, a type known among the Russians as sulitisa, that is mentioned at a time in the Volga Bulgar region. And it is said at a point to have been used particularly to oppose Tartar archery, which is interesting because it shows that albeit Turkic in origin, those people had turned into something really more similar to that Western area, or the fringe area, let's say, at the frontier between the steppe and the forest, let's say. Whereas, and also the fact that the Mongols were in fact different in that regard, that still a javeliner was meant to come as close and to run even after an opponent to attack him with a javelin, right, in spite of the advantage that by a certain degree the bow could have, because really it doesn't depend on the individual, it depends on the formation, right, that are much bulkier and that come at that close range. So reasoning in terms 1 versus 1 in warfare basically doesn't have any sense. People like doing it all the time, and so these people just fought with what mostly they had. And so this shows that archery, albeit important and developed, as there was a big deal, of course, of composite bows, a remarkable variety of arrowheads that were properly designed for different type of targets, etc. Still was this kind of, greater habit of being just maybe like a random farmer, knowing how to use a bow, but still, being good with javelin. At a point, if you were threatened by a Tartar raider, you would still use that, rather than being just like that archer living literally his entire life on horseback, like a Mongol could be, right? So something really different culturally wise. We look even at axes, as we were saying before, as an interesting feature of Volga Bulgar warfare. In fact, from the 10th to the 13th century, with the consolidation of the Volga Bulgar dominion, we see that kind of more sedentary change and various foreign imports, etc., increasing, right? Even with the appearance of newer types of weapons. For example, the light armor breaking or armor piercing axe that had become the most typical weapon of an elite Volga Bulgar cavalryman in the previous era had evolved into the almost universal pole axe that would be widely used by foot soldiers eventually. And this is also radically interesting because it's not a wild horseman of the steppe anymore. It's someone who can even invest more in an important, sometimes even anti-cavalry weapon, at least at close range, not much for stopping charges, because only pikes stop charges when you are on foot. But still, in fact, documenting within the same Bulgar warfare, so not necessarily just against nomad enemies that actually, when they came, razed everything to the ground, and those, because they were the Mongols, by the way, but up to that point had not seemingly posed much of a threat. On the contrary, documents, in fact, Bulgar versus Volgar type of fight, and so also this on a close range, or maybe even for a fight could happen within these towns, within these populated areas, with also, as we've seen, ramparts, palisades, things that would give the infantry an edge, is kind of very interesting. And however, the aforementioned external influence in this is also measured among kind of more in fact, external type of weapons, 12th, 13th century Bulgar equipment on the Volga. And we're talking mainly about horse harness, stirrups, rather than weaponry per se. And some say, well, maybe, it's as if it had remained typically Turkic. Well, when something like horse harness and stirrups change, it means that there are also other things that change properly in the entire pack, especially of the heavily armored cavalry. And it does reflect that kind of heavier, kind of and thickly compact, kind of in properly frontally crushing oriented type of cavalry. Axes were similar to some Rusian examples that were in turn nomad influence, but there are decorated axes, for example, that are similar with places as far as Syria, right? And if you look even at the Magyars historically in their migration from the forests to south and west, you realize that this entire Western Eurasian warfare was heavily informed by the Middle Eastern one, right? It was the same spread of siege warfare capabilities, right? Was seemingly very much mutated by the Middle Eastern one, the Sino-Avar or Sino-Persian trebuchet, for example, is something that spreads among these peoples, and again, that's something that the Volga Bulgars would have needed when they quarreled with each other and they had to storm each other's towns, fortresses, and therefore we see that a certain convergence of military styles and technologies that were shared, in fact, between the Rus, the Volga Bulgars, even the Middle East, that is even among the Khazars themselves, that influenced and imported. There were catalyzers and spreaders of this kind of military technology and styles, etc. And all this was fundamentally interrupted by the Mongol tide that really brought in something else. So as we were were saying before, the Volga Bulgars disappeared as separate entity. And we see in their warfare, in fact, some kind of typical re-Turkic Mongolization of warfare, by a certain degree at least. As you know, also the Mongols were heavily influenced by local warfare in turn. But generally speaking, there is probably a different type of culture and community that has been formed, a much more autocratic one, a much more also raid-based one, because again, there is a massive crisis that struck Eurasia as well, like also with the same end of the Mongol unity, that brought to a radical autocratization of power. Already the Mongols were bringing in a steppe overlords, oceanic rulers, and that the Volga Bulgars as Turks had timidly kind of abandoned. First of all, no empire had achieved what the Mongol one had in the steppes. So there were some massive changes just connected to that. But generally speaking, we've seen the Volga Bulgars had began to probably have also, I can't say a more egalitarian culture, but it's the same thing you see in the Kievan Rus, right? Before the Mongols invaded them, in spite of the political crisis that had already been evident in the early 13th century, and that's the major reason also why the Rus were taken over. It's not that the Mongols were unstoppable or had to literally conquer everything they found, but there had still been a balance between the prince and kind of the mercantile estates, let's say, of these great Russian cities, of great Russian rivers. And that middle class is wiped out. Like, in fact, this is the same reason why with the Mongols, actually the Russia that we know came to exist, right? Before, the Rus was much more like Central Europe by a certain degree. After that, there is a massive autocratization, privatization, princely rule, and so the middle class is evaporating in a way. So as a consequence, in the Volga Bulgar context, what seems to have happened is similar. That is to say, the Mongols reject the idea of a ultra elite, and then all the other troops are fundamentally impoverished tributaries that can't just afford fighting on horseback, like basically very poor armor, etc. There is naturally in late medieval times happening of some of these forces. For example, even firearms spread relatively early, right? As in 1367, the Bulgars are documented having defended themselves during a siege with apparently firearms, as actually often the concept of shooting there philologically doesn't tell us exactly what it's referring to. For example, large ballistas, like the one were found in some Russian cities as well during the Mongol era, the time of the Mongol invasion, and we don't even know whether they were Mongol or Russian, as a matter of fact. Or actual guns. And I've studied, fairly well, at least extensively, the period, generally speaking, in Eurasia. I must say that as soon as gunpowder technology was used for military purpose, as soon as it spread anywhere, it was immediately used for that, right? It's a myth that the Chinese made fireworks with that. No, it's just for some reason that had probably to do with the type of targets that were striking, maybe in Asia. The construction of buildings and forts, etc., that were more kind of incendiary than explosive oriented. They had less saltpeter fundamental. Europeans instead began to use it in a much more, in a much harsher way, perhaps because their battlefields had much more armor around, and there was plenty of fortifications everywhere, in a very thick net. So they needed that kind of explosive, destructive dimension. The Mongols had a true idiosyncrasies towards guns, but it was also the aforementioned seigneurial, feudal kind of bias against this hellish, stinking gunners that were mocked as cowards, etc. This is something you find even as a bias in the early Ottoman armies, even though they began to spread eventually quite quickly. Also, military technology topping it for 200 years in the same Europe. So it's a love-hate relationship, we can't say. That, however, shows that still, guns were pretty much used, and as soon as they spread, probably as early as the 13th century, even among the Volga Bulgars, were used, right? And I don't go too far because we just are not particularly well informed. But generally speaking, I mean, they had pretty good siege warfare capabilities. We have no reason not to think otherwise. Going back to armor, as we were saying before, there is a lot of evidence of mail, but surely it was also lamellar armor that perhaps was reinjected, surely more among in post-Mongol times, no doubt, but was already there. The same goes for scales, especially in the early era. And we see also very heavily armored troops. Like for high medieval times, you see that were even multiple layers of armor worn, like padded armor, then coat of mail, then something like with lamellar, and then even yet another padding or even another mail on it. Like in the latter case would be the ultra heavy cavalry you could find everywhere, say anywhere in the world. And the elite did fight like that. It just was ultra heavy. They were used as reserve in the final moment of the battle, and they didn't even run. Basically, just sometimes they charged at pace, literally, because they were so heavy that was enough to smash anything in front of them. But they were overbearingly costly, and they needed massive mounts just in order to support all the weight. But again, mostly Volga Bulgar cavalry was made up of light cavalry, right? Maybe, again, more close combat bias than the average step one, but still light cavalry. Shields also nothing specifically distinctive. They used the Turkic name of Kalkan among the Volga Bulgars. What we see actually, what I forgot to say about armor that is more interesting, because especially in the presence of heavy cavalry, what you see as in the West is that the heavier the cavalry meant, the smaller the shield. I made several videos about Western steppes, Western Eurasian steppes warfare, and we have documented this dramatically. So if you're interested, I have playlists about this. But the interesting thing is that these areas, even though again they're not particularly well documented statistically, tell us that plate armor was already around by the 12th century, right? And many people think, in fact, that Western Europe was essentially adopting it by degree of osmosis, when especially the Mongol tide arrived at the gates of the Holy Roman Empire, and so surprise, surprise, you start finding plate armor, especially in Eastern Germany, that was not even the most advanced part of Germany in metallurgically speaking, but that it could be something. Like there are, even among the Slavs, there are, there's the typical Polish belt that is organic and represented, but it looks essentially alike what metal or like kind of plate armor would have developed into anatomically. So there are references naturally to plate armor, especially to chest plates for horses, chamfrons, etc. as well, even in places like Hungary. So the idea is that plate armor, for some reason, developed earlier in those areas, mostly and likely because of maybe just it's. I don't think it's even like there was anything in the steppe that was particularly more insidious. Not even the fact that projectiles arrived from different directions, whereas Western warfare was more frontal. So at a point, this plate armor developed mostly around the abdomen, all the way back the torso. So that's kind of the idea, but it's also the degree of armoredness of the elite that in some ways was even more advanced than existed in Western Europe, but it was just the ultra elite. We see the typical mask visors and those may have to do also with the higher degree of arrow fire that rained like hell, this type of warfare. But again, just for the elite. So an elite that would have more regularly to just get into a hail of arrows that the Westerners weren't really quite as, meeting with as much, right? Even certain developments of chest plates, etc., were not so, that did exist in the West at some point, right? Also influenced by the East, were never, or additional armor, say, on the chest that do not seem to have eventually had much of a future before properly plate armor came about in the 13th century. So that may be the reason. Even though crossbows were insidious, they weren't as creating as much volume of fire as collectively as normally bows would do in the steppe. So that's kind of the reason. So the crossbow, at least at close range, was somewhat more powerful, but it also was less likely for you to encounter it, right? So everything had a cost, and at some point it was even better to have kind of lighter armor, so that you can maybe, with a spare one, equip other people, and making tactics effective than overloading you. So that depended on the community, on the culture, right, on the political, social segmentation, not on the technology per se. That is always created for tactics, and minimally the other way around, even though it's very difficult for people to understand because we've been poisoned with technologistic bias ever since we've been born, and unfortunately we would need an actual vaccine for that. And yeah, this is pretty much it. So I think the essentials of Volga Bulgar warfare are here. I would like to stress this is, again, just an introductory video about Volga Bulgar warfare. So at some point we will make much more, hopefully, with time allowing and more, a video as I'm doing for all peoples, basically in the entire ancient medieval history all over Eurasia, North Africa, the army organization, tactics, armor, unit types in detail, right? A video for each of these things in various eras, etc. So that you can in fact already confrontate what I've been doing here with other stuff I've already done about other steppe peoples. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.